we are here because we're talking about crisis management and communications, right? So I hope you're at the right presentation. And the format I had in mind is to speak for about 20-25 minutes, max 30 minutes, and keep the rest of the time for Q&A, because I want this to be more interactive and more useful to all of you rather than lecturing. That's not my preferred style of presentation. So we called it Herding Cats and Managing Crisis, how they're inherently similar. And I am a program director here at Cal Lutheran. I direct the Masters in Public Policy program currently, but I'm speaking here from my previous experience and also some of the experiences I've had over the last 2 years managing COVID situation, right? So I think once you're a communications professional, you're always a communication professional, right? That's the sense that I'm using my past experiences and current sort of role to showcase some of the ideas that I have developed and evolved in my own thinking. And just to give you a background, I've been a PR/public affairs professionals. I grew up in India, where I worked for many years. Then I moved to Dubai, UAE, where I did some very interesting communications work involving several industries. So I worked on the agency side. I worked with Ogilvy PR in Bangalore, India, where I'm from. I did some very interesting work on social change communications, public health related issues, which actually won a global award for communications back in the day when I was much younger. I'd like to believe I'm still young, but my days of glory are in communications, I think, are past me now. So since then, I've become a nonprofit executive. I've run NGOs in Washington, D.C., in California. I also consult. I sit on boards of a couple of NGOs. And my full-time job is, as I said, as an academic. I've written books on nonprofits, remittances, philanthropy. So you can talk to me about a few things. But here we are to talk about more specifically issues related to crisis communications and crisis management. So getting into the weeds, I think the outline for today, and hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you'll have a better sense of what is a crisis and what is not a crisis, right? Because the word is thrown around very loosely. So I will help define that. And more importantly, if there's this one thing that you can walk away from today's presentation, one big takeaway is how do you prepare for a crisis, right? Because preparation is everything in my view, because until and unless you're prepared, you cannot really deal with the things that might happen, right? Because preparation, of course, cannot prepare you for everything. There are a lot of unanticipated outcomes that can happen. However, without preparation, you are guaranteeing failure, right? So that's the sort of philosophy that I'm coming from. And also, we'll talk a little about building a team around preparedness. Like how do you articulate your ideas for building a team? Who should be on a crisis management or crisis communications team? Who should not be on a team, right? So we'll discuss some of those ideas. And also, more importantly, think about what is the kind of leadership you need during a crisis, and what role does leadership play? And it could either be you. I mean, you could be a leader in a crisis situation, or it could be your colleagues. It could be even a team. So we'll talk a little about that as well, because as we understand, leadership is extremely crucial. I'm sure you will all agree that leadership is determines whether a crisis can succeed or not, right? So before we move further, I want to also clarify that we'll talk a little bit of theory, not too much, because I think, as I said, understanding concepts is important before we talk about them, right? So, but then again, most of the remaining workshop is interactive, so I expect you all to engage. Feel free to talk to each other. We'll have small breakout rooms, and we'll also talk to each other as we proceed. Feel free to interject if there's something is not clear. Feel free to either send a chat in the Q&A in the chat box or ask me. I'm happy to clarify. So with that out of the way, let's look at two case studies and see what are we really dealing with here, right? And what do we mean by a crisis? And then we'll talk a little about how can we think about managing a crisis, right? Has anyone seen this movie on Netflix called Downfall? I wasn't looking for a scary movie, but I like horror and scary movies. and real life based stuff that kind of disturbs you a little bit. So I watched this, and believe me, it is a scary movie in the sense, unfortunately happened. All this is real, right? These two Boeing 737s crashed in 2017 and 2018 in Indonesia and Ethiopia, killing hundreds of people. But 346 people died as a result of these crashes. And these are relatively new planes, right? These are not like rickety 30-year-old planes, but somewhat relatively new, well-functioning flights that just crashed. And a lot of investigation went into what really happened. Why did they crash, right? And while the investigation was going on, and of course, initial details, they hadn't found the black box, and all of the stuff was sort of still uncertain. Boeing went ahead and made a claim that it was the pilot's fault. It was the pilots who were not trained. They didn't do their job, and they put all the blame on the pilots of these two planes, right? So they did, as a company. So we're looking at this case as a crisis for Boeing, the aircraft manufacturer, right? So they spun it in a way which tried to protect their image. And of course, the stocks took a huge hit given the safety of the aircrafts. And of course, we all know what happened in 2020, right? Immediately following the second incident, there was COVID, right? So with all the travel stoppages and everything else, it sort of doubly hurt Boeing, which is the leader in aircraft manufacturing around the world. And Airbus was number two. Airbus is a European company. So Boeing was the market leader at that point. And once you see the documentary, you'll realize what the real political issues were internally and how badly they managed this whole crisis. So long story short, the crisis itself, the crashes were managed in a way which put the blame on the pilots. They did not really acknowledge the technical issues, and subsequently they found out that the real issue was the software that was being used, and it was entirely Boeing's fault and nobody else's, right? So let's just keep that in mind as we move forward to try and understand what we can learn from these situations and how they could have potentially done this better. And if we are ever in such a situation, what might we do? I think it's more a liability issue, more also a reputational issue, right? Because who wants to give orders for new aircraft with a company that has software issues, right? If you're a government of a country and you want to buy aircrafts, wouldn't you rather go with a company that knows what it's doing, right? So it is more reputational than of course, in addition to the liabilities involved. So yeah. So moving on, this is a slightly older case, and again, this is used to talk about crisis management and leadership. Tylenol, in '82, several people died after consuming the over-the-counter, tablets of Tylenol, and immediately, this is a best-case scenario that Johnson & Johnson, sort of the best-case scenario that they could manage. So they pulled about 31 million bottles, which actually cost them quite a bit of money, right? And they also went a step further and actually announced, worked with several health organizations and recalled, also sent out warnings about what to do in case you consumed it, or what are the best practices to be put in place. So they also introduced tamper-proof packaging to educate customers and basically build trust with consumers, because again, it's a mass consumer brand and something horribly had gone wrong, and they had to act immediately to sort of save their face, and more importantly also to save people, because they had caused the problem, right? So let's keep these two cases as we move forward. I have quite a bit of material, so I'm going to be speaking fast. Forgive me for that, because again, this can be like 11 weeks, right? So we're trying to crunch this into 1 hour. So let's talk very quickly about what is a crisis. As I said, we'll talk a little about definition. So one way to define crisis is, I've used the definition offered by these scholars in this book, Politics of Crisis Management, where they say crisis is a significant moment where the very existence of an organization or entity is threatened, right? So that's the important point to keep in mind, that if not handled properly, the entire organization or entity can crumble, right? So it's an existential threat. So I think that's the important point to keep in mind. And they could be of many forms. They could be political, economic, cultural, ethical, right? As we can see, and as we are seeing today, correct? So we in the last couple of years, we've all lived through COVID, right? So COVID is an existential crisis. We can all agree to that, right? Several companies have gone under, hundreds and thousands of restaurants have closed, right? So several nations have come close to bankruptcy due to COVID. And of course, there are several other crises happening as we speak, correct? We're talking about Ukraine, we're talking about the stock market crisis, we're talking about the migrant crisis in some places. Again, the question is, who is it a crisis for? So that's the political question. We'll get to that later. But for now, let's just talk a little about, and I know there are a few people on this call, why don't we talk just for 2 or 3 minutes about what crisis have you lived through? Did you foresee these crises? And what was the reaction of those around you to those crises? And of course, when people's livelihood is threatened, it's not a pleasant thing, right? It's pretty serious and pretty immediate for those who are around you, and even for yourself, I'm assuming, right? So thanks for sharing that. Anyone else wants to chip in? Again, let's ask ourselves, who's a crisis for, right? Is it a crisis for, depending on your perspective, you could say it's an environmental crisis, or it's a crisis for BP, right? And that both answers would be correct, right? Because if we believe that we are messing up planet Earth and that climate change is real, then every little crisis like that adds to that, right? Rather than taking away from the kind of catastrophe we are heading towards. But even if you don't believe in climate change and everything that's happening to Earth, from a company perspective, it could really bankrupt BP, correct? Because in the past, things have happened which have bankrupted a company. All it takes is one big incident, right? So keeping that in mind is important. Arun, thank you for joining. Professor Manoharan is our colleague from Boston, a good friend of mine. Thanks for joining, Arun. Yes, COVID and the communication surrounding it. Yeah, we are still living through it, right? We are living through, I remember the first week of COVID, I was teaching in March on campus, and I feel so foolish about this, but actually when people started talking about it, I had very little knowledge and I was absolutely ignorant about public health issues. So I said, yeah, it's probably like the flu, it'll go away in a week or two. I was among those people, right? And I mean, in hindsight, we all know how ridiculous that sounds now. So great examples. Thanks for sharing. Let's keep moving forward. Feel free to interject if you have any questions. So why did I call the topic how is it similar to herding cats? Beyond the fact that I love cats and I'm the biggest cat fan around, I think it is also like herding cats, because according to a professor who does a lot of environmental governance, and I fully agree with his quote. He says it's when you're managing a crisis like an environmental crisis, there are too many actors and each one wants different things, right? If you think of even the situation that we just described now, in any crisis, there are multiple actors, and each actor reads the situation differently and wants something out of that situation, wants a certain resolution, right? Even for instance, if take COVID, for example, if you are a university or if you're a business and you start hearing news about something going on and things sort of going south, your first immediate gut reaction is, how is it going to affect my finances, right? How is it going to affect my stability, and what's going to happen to our students, our staff? Whereas there is usually less concern about outside factors. So the locus of interest shifts towards yourself, right? Whereas if you're looking at the same crisis from a different, if you're a city manager of, say, a city of Thousand Oaks, then you're looking for something else. Your concern is public safety, right? Your concern is public health, rather than whether a place is closed for a week or two. So there are different interests, is what I'm trying to get at. So in that case, given different actors and different interests, people might react differently. So given their multiple and diverging interests, each party having different interests, it becomes hard to gather them together, right? And we are still struggling, as you can all agree, to get people together to respond to something like COVID. Like even today, that's a struggle, right? We've lived for more than 2.5 years through this stuff, and we still don't 100% agree whether we should be masking. We still don't 100% agree on whether we should all be vaccinated. We still don't all agree on multiple things, right? Even though the reality is almost 1 million Americans have died, right? And I believe the number in other parts of the country is also pretty scary. So how do we herd those cats? How do we herd those actors together to achieve what we want to achieve, which is basically managing the crisis and resolving it, right? And we'll talk about the stages of crisis management and resolution in a bit. But I just want to frame that as a challenge. It's not something easily done. It's easier said than done, right? Easy for me to make a presentation in an hour, but for people to actually manage it is incredibly hard, right? So I also want to draw the distinction between risk communication and crisis communication. Again, this is a very vast topic. You'll find a lot of material if you look for it, but very quickly, risk communication is basically what might happen. So sort of foreseeing what might happen in the future. This is again a technical difference. Whereas crisis communication is and management is dealing with what has happened now, right? And again, we talked about a few examples of crises, so I will not spend too much time on that. Let's spend just a minute on crisis communication and leadership, the role of leadership, the role of leaders in defining a crisis. As I said just a minute ago, leadership is crucial for any crisis management situation, right? Because ultimately, beyond the hero worship, beyond looking for the savior complex, right? So we might say, okay, certain cultures do that and other cultures are more communal. They look for communal solutions. Regardless of that, I think universally, there's a need among human beings and even animals, if you look at it, for a leader or a set of people to lead, to define reality, right? If you just take a step back, ultimately, leadership is about defining what's going on, right? Think about that for a minute, because if you don't know what's going on, a lot of times during the crisis, there is that information gap, right? It could be a few hours, could be a few minutes, could be a few days, it could be a few weeks, right? In the case of COVID, I would say it was a few weeks, right? Before people really figure out, okay, is this an epidemic? Is it a pandemic? How dangerous is it? What the hell will happen if we don't do something, right? So that information gap is not only dangerous, but as I said, it can be existentially important. If you do not act or react appropriately in that time, you are basically screwed, right? You are done, and your people around you are also finished in many cases existentially, right? So that leads automatically to this technical term called contraction of authority, meaning naturally, as when people are scared or afraid or uncertain, don't know what the hell's going on, people tend to look to their leaders for answers, right? Whether those leaders give them the right answers or wrong answers is a different thing, right? That's a different question. Regardless, people look to their leaders, either technical leaders, political leaders, social leaders, religious leaders, whatever shape or form. They look to authority figures for answers, saying, please tell me what's going on. I want to understand what's going on because this is scary. Number one, I haven't seen anything like this before. I want to deal with it, and I want to protect myself and people around me, right? Family, friends, whoever there is. And again, there's a lot of literature, there's a lot of scholarship around this, and very good research as well on contraction of authority. But I would argue, again, this is my perspective, that contraction of authority is natural in these cases, and maybe at times even necessary, right? That you have to have a few leaders. Everybody cannot lead, right? Because if everybody starts defining reality, then you're going in 20 million directions, and that's not good, right? Because you have few choices to make. So let's also keep that in mind as we move forward. This reminds me of a childhood proverb my mom used to share with me. I grew up in a very traditional household, and she would say this sort of from the Islamic perspective, that anytime even three people travel, if you're going on a journey, she would say you should assign a leader, right? Because you need somebody to tell people what to do. Not all the three people cannot be making decisions. Let one person decide, let the other two agree that, okay, this is the best person to lead us on this journey. Let's follow his or her directions, right? So this is sort of a folk wisdom, but I think there's some truth to that as well, right? So in terms of core tasks or stages of crisis leadership, we talked about what is leadership. We talked about how to define it or who defines it. This is sort of getting into the weeds a little bit and sort of framing this whole thing in terms of a crisis, what really happens, right? So Boyne and the book that I referenced to you, and even other scholars have defined various stages of leadership management, crisis management, and the role of leadership. And they say broadly there are 5 stages. One is sense making, So you're defining what the hell's going on, right? How do we deal with it? What is the problem really, right? And secondly, decision making in terms of what do we do? How do we fix this, right? What measures do we take? Do we need a vaccine? Do we need mask up? If you take COVID as an example, right? Do we need to shut down schools and offices, or can life go on, right? And again, just keeping that in mind, we can all agree that those are not easy decisions, right? Those are politically very, very difficult decisions, financially, culturally, socially, very difficult decisions to make. Thirdly, related to decision making is meaning making, in the sense of how are we dealing with this as you're going through a crisis? What is it doing to us, right? And I'm sure if you again use COVID as an example, all of us have had difficult conversations with friends, colleagues, relatives, right, about various issues, whether you agree with masking or not, whether you agree with vaccination or not. And it's a can of worms, right? So what are we dealing with? How do we deal with it? Are we doing the right thing? Because all of us have our beliefs, have our ideas. My favorite anecdote is my barber. And I've had the same barber for the last 5 years in California. Lovely guy, young kid, much younger than me. So, but this guy is simply not vaccinated. He's really into fitness and things like that. He feels even today that just by working out in the gym and taking his protein shakes, he's going to fight COVID, right? And I mean, of course I didn't go to get a haircut during COVID, but subsequently had several conversations with him, tried to convince him a little bit, but again, he's made up his mind, right? He's like, oh no, I don't believe in vaccines, never taken them, don't need them. What do you do, right? I'm sure you also dealt with that meaning making process, right? He agrees, yes, it's a real thing, it is a problem, it is a pandemic. However, his solution is different. He's like, no, I'm just fit, I'm a young guy, I don't need vaccine to protect me. So that's the meaning making part of it. How do communities of people, how do organizations, or how do individuals make sense of that process to resolve a crisis? Terminating is, I mean, there's always a process of terminating a crisis, meaning a crisis cannot go on forever. Can we agree to that? Because if a crisis is going on forever, then people will stop treating it as a crisis, right? Even at some point, we will have to say, okay, COVID, even Dr. Fauci recently said, okay, the pandemic phase is over. We're in the epidemic stage now, right? So the mass transmission stage is gone. So we can relax a lot of the norms. So that's the crisis termination stage, though we are not fully terminated it, but we're getting close to it with COVID. And of course, learning. So after every crisis, as human beings, we all learn from the experience, right? So what went right, what went wrong, people get together. And again, leadership is important to define what's really going on. So another quick Q&A here, or a group discussion for all of us. Let's talk a little about a moment when you've had to form a team to deal with a crisis in either your workplace, your family, or what have you. And let's talk for a few minutes about what did you do, who led that situation, or who was the crisis leader. And let's talk a little about what do you think could have been done better, and what lessons did you draw from that? Let's try to cover all the 5 stages that we just talked about, right? Crisis definition, management, and learning. So anybody willing to share? I think going off of the fact that, leaders being unable to realize what's going on in the world around them and making sense of the meaning, and focusing maybe very narrowly on their financial interests, right? Because if he or she, it could be a she as well, right? CEOs can make those sorts of calls or decisions, based on maybe political motives, right? They want to please the governor, or they want to please the state they're in. They're afraid that if they say something controversial, which goes against their, the political party's belief, it might hurt them financially. However, as you rightly pointed out, if the CEO is not taking into account the stakeholders or the shareholders' interests and values, and also the broader social context, then it can hurt even the reputation of the company, right? More than just the short-term financial loss or other penalties. So yeah, that's a great point. I had through crisis management some wildfires, yes. Impacted the headquarters. It was hundreds of employees, worked with the CEO to work through the plan of action. It was a great learning opportunity to get some guidelines for any future crisis. And specifically, again, this is an ongoing issue, right? Every year we have the fire season. So any specific things you want to share in terms of I'm sure you have some sort of crisis preparedness plan, right, in terms of communication. Do you have like a team that manages it, or how does that work? I'm going to skip this example because we have heard a few examples, and already I've shared with you the biggest faux pas of my life, which is dismissing COVID when it started. So as I said, let's just walk through quickly the first two steps, which we talked about briefly, and some actual practical advice for some of you who may be here for that reason, in terms of how do we actually prepare for a crisis, right? So as I said earlier, we need to define a crisis when it's happening or is about to happen. And the challenges at this stage are generally a lack of complete information, right? So we don't know what this thing is. We don't know why a plane crashed. We don't know why people are getting sick, right? We don't know why the stock market is going down so much, right? Is it just a short-term thing, or is it actually a major disaster in terms of recession? So lack of complete information is the first characteristic in a crisis, and that's why leadership matters, right? The ability to sort of almost forecast in some ways, or at least read between the lines and say, this is possibly what's going on, and this is how we might have to respond. And other thing, in terms of conflicting interpretations, meaning three different people might see the same thing and interpret it differently, three different ways or five different ways, right? So managing those interpretations, managing that conflict is really what is needed, I think, in those situations. And the question really becomes, what should you do as a leader, or if you're not a leader, as a team member, right? So that's the question I think we can ask ourselves. And this is sort of an open-ended rhetorical question, but a question that's well worth thinking over a little bit. How should you deal with such situations, right? Because like I said earlier, no one here on this call, or any human being, nobody likes ambiguity, right? We like clarity. We can all agree to that, right? However, life, and particularly in crisis situations, is full of ambiguity, right? It's full of uncertainties and unknown information. So it's a question we need to keep in mind and reflect on. How should you act? How should you react, right? Second part is in terms of figuring out decision making. So I have some questions for you. Again, no definitive answers, but I want you to think about it in terms of what should take priority, right? What actions should take priority? Is it, in the case of, say, Disney, financial health? Is it political relationship? Is it maintaining a good corporate image in terms of being a social actor? Or what is it, right? And why should you prioritize these things? I think these are the sort of questions we should be asking if we are in a room and people are making decisions. And if you're part of the leadership team, or if you're the leader, I think these are some broad-based questions we should be asking. These are more tactical questions in terms of implementation. I think these are some questions I want you to think about, and these are almost like templates, right? You can start filling this in, and then you have a crisis management plan, right? So the question is, how do you create a crisis management team? Who should be on that team, right? And again, this implies that you should need a crisis management team, right? If you don't have one, start thinking about it now, right? This moment. Who should be part of that team? Why are they on that team? What qualifies them? Just because the CEO should he or she be on the team? Not necessarily, right? It's good if the leader is well trained in communications, but maybe there's someone else much junior who may have better collaboration skills, who may have better analytical thinking skills, or who may have the technical knowledge of that particular field to lead a crisis response. So figuring out who needs to be on the team is the first step, I would say. More importantly, who do you need to talk to, meaning internally, right? Who do you need to talk to put that team together? Is it HR? Is it the leadership, the core leadership? And again, relatedly, who's involved? Also, who is a key spokesperson, meaning who should talk, right? Who should manage the Twitter handle? Who should manage the Facebook page? Who should be writing the press releases? And who should not, right? Should you put a communications embargo, right, on your communication? And more importantly, how responsive should you be? How quickly should you respond? And how much of detail should you be giving out, right? So these are, again, open-ended questions, and I'm happy to, again, if anybody wants to follow up, happy to share more resources and help you think this through. And lastly, how do you create a media list? Again, we all need friends, and if you have friends in media, bloggers or influencers, it's always helpful, right? So having these are sort of things which you can keep in mind as you move forward. Yeah. So those are more specific questions. I would say, and I'm talking more generally now. I think you should have a broad-based, approach. This is almost like planning for any crisis, right? Financial, like somebody is fired or for whatever reason, or somebody dies, right? So it could be anything. So what I'm suggesting is have a broad-based plan, a team, an approach, and then specifics you can handle. You can change the person involved for a specific case, right, depending on what you're dealing with. Does that make sense? I think here are some general principles of crisis communications and management. And again, this is for the social media age we live in, where things are moving very fast, right? People are tweeting within seconds of something happening, and we need to really be responsive. So some general principles which I found from reading a few material, and of course from my own experience, I fully agree with this, which is we can go through a few points on this list, which is of course paying attention to objective data, meaning at any point, as I said, to the first item on my slide, which is there is no complete information, right? There's no complete truth, or people don't know what they're dealing with. In that case, paying as much attention to objective data, objective knowledge or scientific knowledge when we have it is important, rather than relying on guesswork, right? So that's one starting point. We can all agree on what is objective data. Also paying attention to perceptions, how are people responding? Because fear, as we said earlier, is a very important factor, right? So managing fear is half of your problem. And related to that is managing internal communications. How do you deal with internal issues within an organization, rather than mainly focusing on the external environment? So even how are we talking to each other? Are we trusting each other, right? When a crisis happens, are we believing what we are hearing from our colleagues? So that internal process is also very important to manage. And knowing also that purely objective understanding of a crisis is not going to save the day. We also need to have empathy. We need to have some sense of showing our human side and saying we know little stuff, we don't know everything, and all of us are going through this together, right? So having that sense of empathy is crucial. And finally, also knowing that being proactive is very important. You cannot just send a press release in 3 months and say, okay, I'll talk to you later, right? That's the last thing you should be doing. In any crisis, it's better to over communicate, or at least overshare, in the sense of not sharing sensitive information, but sharing what you know is going on, and building that communication channel with people as much as possible, rather than remaining silent, right? Because silence can actually destroy your reputation. It can actually build barriers. People don't trust you, right, if you're too silent for too long. So, and also being proactive, telling people, okay, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, and working with that, I think is extremely crucial, right? So these are some very general principles. And I want to start wrapping up here, because I know I did tell you I'll give you a plan, but these are sort of the outlines of a communication plan, right? And we can talk for a few more hours if needed. I know we don't have time for that, but as I said, I'll leave some resources at the end, so you can, if you're interested, you can follow up and build your own communications plan. I'm happy to also give you some more thoughts. But to quote Professor Adil Najam, who's actually an important figure in environmental governance, he says, if you want to really hurt cats, be nice to them, right? Meaning, find out what motivates them, what treats you can give them to bring them closer to you, right? You can't take a stick and you can't beat cats into submission, right? Similarly, you cannot beat your team players into submission during a crisis. You cannot force your authority and just let people, command people, even though sometimes you may have to, but it won't last forever. If you're constantly commanding and pulling people around into doing what you're doing, you have to convince them. You have to sort of bring them to your point of view, force of reason, force of argument, force of empathy, whatever. Use any tool you have in your kit, right, to bring people to your point of view and your way of thinking. That's how you're going to succeed in terms of managing crisis, right? And lastly, I want to end with this. One of my favorite books I read as a teenager back in the day was this book by Andy Grove. It's a classic, business classic. Andy Grove is one of the founders of Intel Corporation, and the book is called Only the Paranoid Survive. And I remember reading this book like more than once. I was fascinated by his ideas. Basically, the moral of his the story in his book is that there are what he calls strategic inflection points, meaning points in any business or society's life when all the rules of the game change, right? think about Kodak and digital technology in camera. Think about movies and streaming, right? Blockbuster. Think about BlackBerry and iPhone, right? I proudly held on to my BlackBerry for many, many years. I refused to buy an iPhone, thinking that it was for children. And somehow I felt BlackBerry was for adults, iPhone was for kids, but now you know what I have, right? So again, a strategic inflection point which BlackBerry did not foresee or they ignored, right, to their own peril. Think about all the hundreds and thousands of bookstores that have closed, right, with the advent of Amazon. So I think all those organizations have dealt with those crises, right? And those have been the strategic inflection points for some of them who made an opportunity of those crises, and for others who did not adopt, that's been the moment of their end, right? So that's the end of the company or organizations in that case. So I want to leave you with that thought that if managed well, crises can be an opportunity. Not always, but in most cases, I firmly believe even individual crises, if you're dealing with certain situations, at least in my own life, I have tried to turn every crisis I've dealt with into some form of an opportunity. You know, the idea is to step back, learn from your crisis, see what you've done right, see what you've done wrong. End of the day, there are lessons to be learned, right? There are approaches that you can adopt, which can lead you to being a better person, better leader, better organizations. So I hope this has made some sense. I'm going to pause here, and towards the end of my presentation, there's some resources for those of you who want to follow up. I'm going to stop share screen here and leave any room for questions. We have a few minutes, about 10 minutes left. Open-ended Q&As, free to ask anything you want. So I was in Dubai, 27-year-old self, managing a real estate company with about a $50 billion portfolio across the Middle East and North Africa. I was one of the principal contacts. And I get a call from a journalist around 11 at night, right? So almost hitting bed, get a call from a business journalist who's a good friend of mine. And she says, hey, I just heard that your company is going bust. I'm like, wow, okay. Now, where did you get that from? And she's like, no, this is through the grapevine. And I just want to get a statement from the CEO or your boss, you know, my CEO of my company, because he interfaces with the CEO of the company a lot of times. So she's like, we're going to print pretty soon. I would just want a statement confirming or denying or any details you have. So of course, because the news cycle there is like they print on midnight or 1 o'clock, and it's for the morning's paper, right? So you're talking a few hours gap. And of course, I did the right thing. I called my boss, and he did not have the answer, and he just said, buy some time. And that's one of the things that I did is said, don't have any information, could be true, could be wrong, not saying anything. You know, you're welcome to wait till tomorrow. And here's the deal I made with her. I negotiated with her saying, if there's anything new, anything along these lines, you'll be the first to know. So I got that sort of deal with her saying, do not print anything till we get back to you. And if we get anything that we hear, you'll be the first one that I'll call. And it did turn out that they were not going bankrupt, but they were on serious losses. And they did have to sell and sort of shell a lot of their assets in several countries across North Africa. But the company survived. The company survived. But that's one little incident where managing the time and expectations, as you said, I've sort of used, and in my view, it's very subjective. I don't think, you know, because each person is different, right? Each journalist or each person who responds to that is very different. And their sense of urgency might determine how quickly you might have to respond. We got back to her the next day within 24 hours. Yeah, we sort of prioritized it. And next day we had an emergency meeting for 3 or 4 hours. We got as much information. Of course, it was panic, right? That's the biggest client. They were paying us hundreds and thousands of dollars every month to manage their communications. So we got as much as we could. We said, this is what is really going on. And we gave them what we could, you know, through official channels. And of course, we try to contain the damage. I hope that's helpful a little bit. If possible, yes, absolutely. Typically, I'd say if there is none or there's no budgets, typically the leader of the unit or the CEO de facto, I think, should take on the lead in terms of becoming the chief communications person or the spokesperson, if the person has training and if they have the aptitude. In some cases, the person may not have the aptitude or the skills or the temperament to be the crisis communicator or spokesperson, in which case I think someone should be delegated. They should be appoint someone as a de facto spokesperson within the leadership team, whoever has the temperament, skills, and the calm mindset to actually think through issues before they speak. So the last thing you want is a loudmouth who's shooting off the hip, right? So that's my suggestion. And also somebody who's trained in media affairs, right? Somebody who knows how to talk to media, somebody who writes, as Aina pointed out, we never covered holding statements and other preparatory material, but those are basically statements that you templates that you can keep written in terms of something happens. Like to your question, Kristen, if there's a fire, right? So you already have written statements which you can copy and paste, saying in this case, we're aware of the situation, blah blah blah, and we're doing XYZ, and in case of any details, contact this person with their number and email, right? So those are called holding statements, which is best practice used in agencies and other companies as well. So having that stuff ready, having a media list ready, having contacts, phone numbers, emails, designate a team or member or group of people if needed, ready to answer queries and questions. I think these are all preparatory stuff you can do beforehand, right? Before anything major happens. And yeah, it can be managed. You don't need a dedicated person if you don't have the budgets or resources to do that. Feel free to send me an email if you have further queries. This is not something that I do full time, but if you want me to come and do a workshop or something, I'm happy to look into it, right? And also consider our MPPA program. I know this is a plugin for my program. We have a master's degree in public policy and administration. We teach some of these stuff in our classes. So if you know someone who's interested in a master's degree, send them our way. I'll be happy to talk to them. And again, thanks, Kristen, for organizing this. It was good to sort of relive some of my communications days and also to sort of make sense of what we're doing now, right? Sort of relate that to my existing role. So this is fun. Hope to stay in touch with some of you, and good luck to all of you. Thanks for joining, Arun, in particular.